They told me she was gone forever, but her handwriting arrived 10 years late, and it changed everything. I remember that morning vividly. Seattle's drizzle had settled into a quiet, rhythmic patter against the workshop skylight. The scent of oil and leather mingled with the faint tang of metal from my tools. I was wiping down the chassis of a '67 Mustang when the envelope slid under the front door mat, as though it had been waiting for me all this time. Yellowed, brittle, and fragile at the edges, it carried a weight far beyond its paper. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. The envelope was thick, almost rigid, and the handwriting, I recognized it instantly, was hers. My wife, long declared dead, had written this letter. My hands trembled as I lifted it, feeling the faintly embossed imprint of ink from a pen used years ago. Inside, a crumpled $2,800 electricity bill fell out, jagged at the corners. A mundane receipt, yet in that moment it felt like a relic of every quiet argument over bills we had shared, every late-night disagreement over money. But this wasn't about electricity. It was about the $25 million she had hidden, and shockingly the way my own son was entangled in her secrets. I sank into the leather chair by the workbench, letting the letter unfold with deliberate care. Each sentence seemed layered in riddles. Mentions of offshore accounts, specific apartment numbers, and a name I hadn't heard in a decade, all pointing to my son's role in shielding her fortune. I noted the faint fingerprints along the flap of the envelope, smudged but deliberate. Someone had touched this before it reached me. The thought twisted my stomach. Was it my son? Had he tampered with it, hoping I'd never open it? I spread the letter across the workbench, pressing my palms against its coarse surface. Every sentence, every underlined date, every monetary figure became a mental bookmark. October 12th. Today was no longer just a date. It was a reckoning. My son's complicity wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a fact, etched in ink and paper. I could hear the faint rustle of the envelope as I handled it, amplified by the quiet hum of the workshop. I traced the crumpled $2,800 electricity bill with my finger, the edges curled and damp from the Seattle air. I could almost hear her voice, sharp, meticulous, reminding me. Check every statement, Everett. Every number tells a story. Memories of her organizing our finances, cataloging receipts, even the smallest mundane purchases, now felt staged, rehearsed to protect a secret none of us had guessed. Out the window the city moved on, cars, pedestrians, the occasional cyclist cutting through puddles, but inside time slowed. My mind catalogued evidence, line by line, number by number. Every crumpled bill, every ledger entry, every whispered call I had overheard my son muttering on the phone, over the years now appeared under a different light. The realization was heavy. My family's history had been a construction, carefully maintained by my own child. I pulled on gloves and picked up the envelope again, noting subtle impressions along the wax seal. Whoever handled it had been careful yet careless enough to leave hints. My son's nervous glances, the hurried exit last week, the whispered calls. They were all pieces of a puzzle now clearly forming. I could almost see him in the hallway, pretending to check a socket or glance at a ledger, every movement choreographed to deflect suspicion. The rain picked up outside, hammering against the workshop roof, as if the city itself was echoing my shock. I unfolded the letter fully, scanning the coded instructions, addresses, account numbers, safe locations, offshore references. Every line was deliberate, a breadcrumb trail my wife had left for me or perhaps for him to manipulate. My hands tightened around the paper, my chest ached, and a strange clarity washed over me, my grief for her death, my trust in my son, my understanding of our life together, all shattered simultaneously. I noticed a faint coffee stain on the bottom edge, yellowed like the rest of the envelope, a small, humanizing flaw that made her absence almost tangible. I set the letter on the workbench beside my notebook and scribbled the first mental notes. Fingerprints, bill dates, suspicious account figures, the apartment she mentioned. I was cataloging everything in real time, aware that the smallest oversight could unravel what little leverage I had left. Footsteps echoed faintly outside, distant yet deliberate. I froze. They didn't belong to the mail carrier. No one had been expected today. My pulse quickened. My son. or someone else. I glanced at the doorway, noting shadows shifting with the rain's angle, imagining the nervous anticipation on his face. Every instinct told me he knew I now held the key to a truth he had spent years concealing. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain just enough to steady my hands. I slid the crumpled electricity bill back under the envelope, aligning the edges carefully. Each crease, each mark, each faded ink line would become evidence. I had always kept meticulous records in my workshop. Receipts for parts, invoices for restoration work, even small personal purchases cataloged by date. Now that same diligence would extend to uncovering the betrayal in my own home. The afternoon wore on, the rain tapering into a persistent drizzle, soft enough to blur the view of the streets below. I stared at the letter again, reading passages I had memorized already, tasting the bitter irony. 10 years had passed, and this single piece of paper had undone a decade of assumed trust. My son, my own flesh and blood, had hidden her fortune, colluded in secrecy, and left me to grieve while orchestrating his advantage. Every sound, the rustle of paper, the faint hum of the heater, the occasional creak of the workshop floor, became magnified. I cataloged the evidence again: fingerprints, crumpled bill, the yellowed envelope, subtle instructions. My mind raced through scenarios, imagining subtle ways to confirm his involvement without alerting him. This was the beginning, the rupture point, the fracture in the veneer of my family life. Even as the shadows lengthened and the city outside dimmed under the overcast sky, I could not stop. I examined the letter one last time before setting it into a secure drawer I rarely used. The key hidden in my coat pocket, the rain's rhythm became a soundtrack to my thoughts. Each drop a marker of time passing, a reminder that action was inevitable. My grief, my anger, my shock, they were all tempered now with purpose. That morning, as the rain continued to fall outside Seattle's gray streets, I understood that life as I knew it had ended. The letter was not just paper. It was a revelation, a catalyst, and a challenge. My son's betrayal was no longer an abstract fear. It was documented, tangible, undeniable. The $25 million, the offshore accounts, the cryptic notes, the fingerprints, they all pointed to a path I would follow with deliberate precision. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of every memory, every smile, every late-night discussion we'd had, all of it now tinged with deception. And for the first time in a decade, I felt the stirrings of resolve. This was no longer about grief. This was about justice, and I intended to claim it. The morning after the letter arrived, I couldn't sleep. Seattle's fog lay thick over the streets, curling around lampposts like smoke from a memory I could no longer trust. I sat at my desk in the workshop, a cup of bitter coffee in hand, and opened my laptop. Emails from the past 10 years blinked back at me, mundane at first glance, but now every subject line, every attachment, every timestamp carried the weight of suspicion. I started with the bank statements. My wife had meticulously documented our accounts, but now the $699,842 transaction from June 2018 screamed for attention. My son had access. He had orchestrated transfers that appeared ordinary on the surface. My hands shook as I cross-referenced the figures with old receipts, invoices, and even the grocery bills my wife had always fussed over. The $1,500 grocery bill from May 2018 didn't make sense. It was double what we usually spent, and it coincided with an unrecorded withdrawal from a minor account. The patterns were subtle, deliberate, but unmistakable. I called my daughter over, asking her to look at the invoices with me. She entered the workshop, eyes scanning the ledgers and receipts spread across my desk. "Dad, these numbers, something's off," she said quietly, pointing at discrepancies in the dates and amounts. She had always been observant, but today her eyes carried a weight, a mix of disbelief and fear. I could feel her questioning my next steps, wondering if my approach was too aggressive, too consuming. Together we examined emails that hinted at conversations my son had been having with third parties, friends, accountants, even a lawyer who had helped my wife manage her estate. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. My stomach tightened as I noticed my son's pattern of leaving abruptly whenever certain discussions came up. I replayed memory fragments, his nervous glance at the ledger shelf last week, his whispered phone call in the hallway, the sudden feigned interest in workshop inventory. Every small action I had once dismissed now revealed a layered deception. Seattle's distant traffic hummed outside as the workshop clock ticked relentlessly. Each tick was a reminder that time had been stolen from me. I cataloged bills, receipts, and emails in a methodical manner. The $4,200 apartment invoice from 2017 surfaced among the files, a payment that hadn't matched any utility or rent schedule. Why hadn't I noticed this before? The answer was painfully clear. I had been looking at numbers, not the story they told. I found myself revisiting old photographs of the family, birthdays, holidays, casual smiles in the driveway. Every gesture now felt rehearsed, every laugh potentially a facade. I could almost hear her voice saying, "Everett, keep your eyes open even when your heart wants to close." The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, and an account balance. My daughter and I set up a chronological ledger, cross-referencing the crumpled bills, receipts, and bank transactions. Each entry was a thread that could unravel the web of deceit. I noticed micro patterns in my son's behavior, how he avoided eye contact, the subtle tensing of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed nervously when confronted with minor financial questions. He was hiding, yes, but his unease was a mirror reflecting his guilt. The workshop provided a strange sanctuary, a reflective space amidst the storm. The distant hum of traffic, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, and the soft creak of the leather chair under me became the soundtrack of revelation. My daughter pulled up emails, showing my son forwarding notes and documents in ways that subtly benefited him, hints of collusion, faint but undeniable. I realized that grief, anger, and moral conflict were entangled, each feeding the other. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was emotional. A theft of trust I hadn't recognized until now. Every memory of shared dinners, casual jokes, and late-night talks with my wife became tainted, layered with suspicion. Yet amid the chaos, I felt a spark of clarity. The law, evidence, and patience would be my instruments. We paused at one particularly telling line in an email from my son, referencing a minor account offshore, phrased as a suggestion, almost innocuous. My daughter's eyes widened. "He's covering tracks, isn't he?" she whispered. I nodded, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Every subtle omission, every half-truth, every whispered phone call over the years now fell into place. The betrayal was intricate, but so was the path to justice. By the end of that day, I had reconstructed a partial map, dates, account numbers, receipts, invoices, all evidence cataloged mentally and physically. I realized that my son's nervous behavior wasn't random. It was a breadcrumb trail, unintentional perhaps, but revealing nonetheless. Every withdrawal, every obscure payment, every subtle misdirection contributed to the emerging picture of deceit. The evening settled over Seattle, fog thickening, streetlights casting halos through the mist. I stood by the workshop window, sipping my now cold coffee, thinking about the decade lost to trust I'd misplaced. I could feel my daughter's presence beside me, steady, vigilant, a quiet ally. Together we would navigate the fracture lines of our family, gathering each piece, noting every anomaly, preparing for the day the truth would emerge fully. By the time the streetlights blinked on, the ledger, emails, receipts, and bank slips formed a pattern I could not ignore. My son's complicity was undeniable. The emotional weight pressed down on me, but beneath it, determination pulsed. This was no longer grief, it was preparation, cataloging, understanding, and planning. And when the time came, the world would see the betrayal not as rumor but as fact, undeniable, and recorded. I never thought that my daughter's curiosity would become our greatest weapon. It started on a quiet Thursday morning, September 18th. Seattle's drizzle had thinned into a persistent mist, the kind that clings to window panes and softens the edges of everything. I watched her move across the workshop floor, careful not to disturb the papers spread across my workbench. Each invoice, each crumpled receipt, every ledger page now carried significance I hadn't realized before. She held up a yellowed note from our late lawyer, dated March 2015, tucked in a folder labeled estate planning. Her eyes widened. "Dad, look at this," she said. It mentioned a $1,500 grocery bill, the same one I had flagged in Act 2, and referenced a subtle instruction regarding transferring small amounts to an unnamed account. It was almost innocuous, but in context it screamed manipulation. I traced the ink with my fingertip, noting faint smudges along the corner. Whoever had handled it before had left the slightest trace, likely my son. I set up a whiteboard, drawing lines and arrows connecting dates, invoices, account numbers, and safe locations. Offshore accounts, apartment rentals, minor transfers. It all began to form a web. Every document became a node, every fingerprint a clue. The workshop clock ticked relentlessly, and the rain outside softened into a gentle patter, underscoring the intensity of focus that wrapped around me like a shroud. I watched my son carefully over the next few days, noting small inconsistencies. He would brush past a ledger as though it held nothing of interest, yet his eyes betrayed him, brief, flickering, and full of avoidance. The micro-expressions were subtle, but I had learned to read them over years of shared work and observation. His whispered phone calls continued, sometimes cut short when I entered the room. The tension was a live wire between us, invisible to anyone else but palpable to me. Meanwhile, my daughter uncovered patterns that even I hadn't anticipated. Dates on lawyers' notes coincided with minor withdrawals from accounts I had assumed were untouched. Receipts matched statements in ways that revealed deliberate concealment. A $699,842 bank slip, previously buried in a stack of innocuous documents, aligned with entries in the ledger that had been carefully erased and re-entered. Each discovery tightened the noose around the truth. I engaged a private investigator, ensuring every step was lawful. The PI's reports added corroboration timestamps, surveillance notes, minor courier trips traced to specific dates and locations. I stored the reports carefully alongside letters and invoices in a secure drawer under the workbench. The physicality of evidence mattered. It anchored the narrative in reality, a confessional unfolding in tangible form. At home, whispers and half-conversations became constant. My son's hesitations at dinner, the subtle dragging of utensils, the way his gaze would dart to doors and windows. It was all becoming a behavioral map of deception. My daughter and I catalogued each movement, each subtle reaction, linking it back to the documents and financial irregularities. Every gesture, every hesitant response, every misaligned ledger page was a breadcrumb leading to the truth. By September 24th, the whiteboard had become a living map. Lines connected invoices, bank transfers, offshore accounts, and safe locations. Subtle patterns emerged. Fridays were often the day of minor withdrawals. Small amounts moved just enough to avoid detection, but creating a rhythm. This rhythm coincided with letters and instructions from my late wife, now clearly meant to test, guide, or expose the culprits manipulating her fortune. I found myself revisiting conversations from years ago, minor disputes over expenses, questions about receipts, and casual remarks that now seemed laden with subtext. My wife's foresight had been precise, leaving clues only a careful observer could connect, and I, ever the meticulous recorder of transactions and actions, was finally piecing it together. The workshop felt alive with subtle tension. The rustle of paper, the soft patter of rain on the roof, and the faint creak of floorboards became part of the soundtrack of discovery. I catalogued every step: ledger inconsistencies, document anomalies, minor misdirections, and whispers from my son's calls. The narrative of betrayal was unfolding in real time, and I could trace it with both heart and mind. By the end of the week, the map was near completion. I had identified potential offshore accounts, correlated invoices with withdrawals, and noted each place my son's actions had deviated from expected behavior. The pieces formed a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Subtle confrontations, whispered phone calls, tampered ledgers, all converged into an undeniable story of betrayal and concealment. Seattle's autumn leaves blew against the workshop windows, orange and red in the fading sunlight. I leaned back in my chair, examining the web of evidence. The betrayal was complex, layered, and deliberate, but so was the path to exposing it. Every detail, every hesitation, every trace left behind was a stepping stone toward justice. My resolve solidified. The truth would not remain hidden. October had arrived in Seattle, and with it came a sharpness to the air that matched the tension in my life. Leaves turned brittle and the mist settled heavier, curling into every corner of the workshop. The whiteboard map from Act 3 dominated one wall now, strings connecting invoices, receipts, offshore accounts, and safe locations. Every line represented betrayal, every date a missed truth. I could almost hear her voice guiding me through the chaos. Trust only what you can touch, Everett. I started the week by contacting the bank to freeze suspect accounts. A legal move, precise and deliberate. Each call required careful phrasing. I had to avoid alerting my son, ensure there was no premature warning, while locking down access to accounts that had already been manipulated. A $4,200 apartment invoice from September 2017 resurfaced as a key detail. The timing matched transactions that had previously seemed incidental. My daughter retrieved digital copies of emails he had sent to obscure associates, messages that suggested minor misappropriations disguised as routine communications. The son, my son, was a master of subtlety. At dinner one evening, I noticed him pausing mid-bite, eyes flicking toward the ledger shelf, as though calculating the odds of my next move. His hesitation was brief, but it told me more than any confession could. The micro-expression, a fleeting tightening around his eyes, the slight lift of a brow was enough. He was nervous, the truth was pressing in, and he knew it. My daughter and I argued briefly over approach. She wanted to confront him directly, to force disclosure. I refused. Timing, patience, and precision were essential. Every move had to be deliberate. The stakes were higher than emotion. This was about justice, legacy, and the restoration of the life my wife had protected. Every crumpled bill, every ledger inconsistency, every fingerprint traced back to my son was a thread in a tapestry of betrayal that would not unravel if handled recklessly. I documented everything: receipts, emails, invoices, timestamps. Even the smallest phone ping on his device became a piece of evidence when cross-referenced with withdrawals. Subtle clues emerged: patterns in Friday withdrawals, courier trips, interactions with associates. Each anomaly formed a clear narrative when paired with the letters from my late wife. The workshop had become a theater of observation. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper, every distant rain patter was a cue in the unfolding drama. On October 5th, a minor dispute arose. My daughter questioned my strategy, her voice sharp with concern. "Dad, are we moving too slowly? He's aware we're watching him." I looked at her, calm but resolute. Every action must be documented, every step undeniable. We're building a case, not seeking instant gratification. Her nod was hesitant, but she understood. The tension between caution and urgency mirrored the larger emotional landscape of betrayal we were navigating. Meanwhile, I continued observing my son's micro-expressions. A glance at the ledger, a pause mid-conversation, the slight hesitation in answering routine questions, all were now catalogued, mapped against financial activity. The workshop's ambiance, soft rain, metallic tools, rustling papers, heightened every perception, every subtle sign of guilt. The $4,200 apartment invoice became pivotal. It was linked to minor offshore withdrawals, each subtle enough to avoid immediate detection but patterned enough to indicate intent. My daughter highlighted matching entries in emails that showed him attempting to rationalize the transactions, covering them with plausible deniability. His micro-behaviors, hesitation, sudden distractions, averted gaze, now complemented concrete evidence. By October 7th, the net was closing. Legal freezes were in place, digital evidence collected, and behavioral observations meticulously recorded. The son's nervousness was no longer casual. It was a signature of culpability. Every interaction at home, every whispered phone call, every pause during casual conversations contributed to the intricate web of betrayal we were mapping. Seattle's dusk filtered into the workshop through the windows, amber light cutting across invoices, ledgers, and the whiteboard web of deception. I traced each thread again, confirming alignments between financial anomalies and micro-behavioral patterns. Each revelation reinforced my resolve. The betrayal was multi-layered, calculated, and deliberate, but so was the path to exposing it. In that quiet moment, with rain tapping softly against the roof, I realized that truth, methodical observation, patience, and legal precision would unravel the deception more effectively than confrontation. My son's errors, subtle as they were, had created a roadmap. Every hesitation, every misstep, every nervous glance had become a breadcrumb trail, and I was ready to follow it to its conclusion. October 8th began like any other Seattle morning, gray skies, damp streets, and the rhythmic hum of traffic. But inside the workshop, the air was thick with tension. Every crumpled bill, every ledger entry, every digital trace my daughter and I had collected became part of a strategy. This wasn't just about uncovering betrayal anymore. It was about consolidating evidence in a way that could not be denied. I reached out to our lawyers and accountants, carefully framing each piece of information. Notes were compiled, invoices scanned, and affidavits totaling $8,750 were organized chronologically. The $699,842 bank slip, once an abstract anomaly, now sat beside the $4,200 apartment invoice and the $2,800 electricity bill, forming a concrete, undeniable chain of evidence. Each document was carefully cross-referenced with emails, phone call logs, and courier receipts. My daughter moved efficiently alongside me, documenting digital evidence, timestamping every file, and ensuring that nothing could be questioned in court. Her eyes, sharp and determined, caught details I might have missed in the rush of observation. Together, we built a dossier that mapped every financial irregularity, every misstep, and every subtle attempt at concealment my son had made. The son's errors became more frequent, almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. On October 10th, he left a sticky note on the ledger, attempting to disguise an entry he had altered. My daughter discovered it, quietly tapping me on the shoulder. "Dad, he's slipping." I smiled, bitterly but with purpose. Every oversight was a thread I could pull, tightening the net around him. We methodically cross-checked courier receipts with withdrawals and offshore account transfers. Subtle patterns emerged. Fridays were consistent for minor withdrawals, small packages sent under aliases, occasional trips to the bank timed with emails from his associates. Each detail painted a clearer picture of deliberate deception. By mid-October, the son's anxiety was palpable, even from across the workshop. He would linger near the ledger, feigning interest, yet his micro-expressions betrayed him. Slight tenses in the jaw, the fleeting lift of a brow, a sudden glance toward the door. The combination of financial evidence and behavioral observation created an unassailable narrative. On October 15th, we held a quiet review session. I sat with the whiteboard, tracing lines connecting invoices, withdrawals, and offshore accounts. My daughter annotated, highlighting minor discrepancies and reinforcing the chain of culpability. The crumpled bills, sticky notes, ledger entries, and digital evidence now formed a comprehensive roadmap of betrayal. Every anomaly was cataloged, every behavioral clue noted, and every document secured. Outside, the rain fell steadily, a background soundtrack to our methodical work. I noticed the soft click of my son's footsteps in the hall, the faint rustle of paper as he moved about, unaware that every action had been tracked and every misstep recorded. By the time evening settled over Seattle, the net had closed considerably. I leaned back in my chair, tracing my finger along the lines connecting each piece of evidence. The magnitude of his betrayal, once abstract and hidden, was now laid bare. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction, not revenge for the sake of cruelty, but the satisfaction that justice would finally have a chance to prevail. The groundwork for the courtroom showdown was complete. Every bill, every ledger, every micro-behavioral observation had converged into an undeniable story of deceit. The son, unaware of the precise extent of our preparations, continued his routine, oblivious that the pieces he had tried so meticulously to hide were now locked into an unbroken chain. My daughter and I shared a silent glance, a mix of anticipation and resolve. The storm was approaching, and we had closed the net. By October 16th, the tension in our household had grown almost tangible. My son, once confident in his subtle manipulations, now moved with a jitteriness that betrayed his inner turmoil. Every step he took, every whispered call, Every glance toward the ledger or the whiteboard map in the workshop hinted at anxiety he could no longer fully conceal. Seattle's autumn evenings had become long shadows, and within our home they mirrored the storm building in my mind. He contacted allies. People I had never even known were part of his network, attempting to shield himself from the repercussions of his actions. Friday withdrawals, once predictable in their minor subtleties, now appeared in larger batches, often coinciding with courier trips. I traced these movements carefully, cross-referencing dates and times with the letters from my wife. The offshore withdrawals matched exactly with instructions she had left behind. The precision of her foresight left me both awed and determined. Within the workshop, every sound became amplified in significance. The soft shuffle of papers, the faint click of tools set down, and the distant rumble of traffic all punctuated the growing storm. I catalogued every encounter, every anomaly, ensuring that nothing escaped observation. Each erratic action by my son was a breadcrumb on the trail, reinforcing the evidence we had meticulously gathered. My daughter worked diligently alongside me, compiling digital records and corroborating them with hard evidence. Minor confrontations surfaced, small disputes over approach and timing, but they only served to clarify priorities. We needed to remain methodical. The betrayal was deep, and the evidence had to be unassailable. I noticed the micro-expressions that had become our secret code: a quick glance toward the ledger, a subtle lift of the shoulders, a pause mid-sentence. My son's behavior was erratic but predictable now that we had mapped his patterns. Even his attempts to mislead us through casual conversations betrayed a rhythm we had come to anticipate. Each misstep, each subtle act of concealment became a piece of the puzzle. The documents, the crumpled bills, invoices, and letters, sat alongside the digital evidence, forming a narrative that would be impossible to dispute. Offshore transfers, minor withdrawals, and courier trips all aligned with her letters. Each entry, each date, each number built a story of deliberate deception, and my son's mounting panic was a confirmation of its authenticity. As the days passed toward November, the crescendo of suspense grew. Seattle's nightly rain pattered against the windows, a steady drumbeat to our vigilance. Whispers in hallways, hurried phone calls, and minor inconsistencies became more pronounced, feeding both anticipation and strategy. The patterns were now undeniable, the net complete, and the final confrontation looming on the horizon. By November 5th, I could trace every withdrawal, every minor errand, and every conversation back to a web my wife had anticipated, and my son had attempted to manipulate. The echoes of suspicion now surrounded him. He could feel them, though he could not identify their source. Our careful observation had transformed into a quiet power, a certainty that would soon manifest in the courtroom. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the precision of our method. Patience, observation, and meticulous documentation had transformed grief into strategy, betrayal into actionable proof. The son's panic was now the evidence's accompaniment, each erratic move a reinforcement of our case. Seattle's fog settled over the city, but within the workshop clarity reigned. The storm of deception had reached its apex, and only the final confrontation remained. November 10th arrived with the kind of chill that cut straight through Seattle's gray streets. The courthouse steps were slick with rain, each footfall echoing against the stone like a prelude to judgment. I carried a folder thick with evidence under my arm: letters, affidavits, crumpled bills, invoices, and the PI reports we had painstakingly compiled. My daughter walked beside me, quiet but resolute, a steady presence in a storm I had spent months mapping. The courtroom itself was austere, the air smelling faintly of polished wood and ink. I scanned the gallery, noting faces I recognized and strangers who would bear witness. My son entered shortly after, confident at first, his charm a thin veneer over what I knew to be growing anxiety. I watched the subtle betrayals in his micro-expressions: the lift of an eyebrow too fast, a shoulder twitch, fingers drumming on the bench. Every movement, every glance was catalogued in my mind. I approached the bench and laid out the first piece of evidence: the yellowed letter from my late wife. The rustle of the pages echoed softly through the room as I unfolded it, showing the precise instructions she had left, the account numbers, and the references to offshore transfers. The judge's eyes flicked over the details, and I could see interest peak as murmurs ran through the room. Next came the crumpled bills: $2,800 electricity, $4,200 apartment, $1,500 grocery expenses, all lined up on the table in neat stacks. Each invoice was paired with annotations, dates, and cross-references to bank statements. The $699,842 bank slip was highlighted, linked directly to my son's transfers. I had cataloged everything, every anomaly, every irregularity, and every document was verifiable. The courtroom became a theater of truth, and each piece of evidence a character in the story of betrayal. My daughter provided quiet annotations confirming dates and linking documents to behavioral observations we had recorded. Every hesitant glance my son had thrown at the ledger in our workshop, every whispered call intercepted or documented, was now part of a coherent, undeniable narrative. I noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted with his pen, and the subtle lift of his eyes toward the gallery. He was aware now, fully aware, and yet trapped by the weight of the evidence. The PI reports were next. They showed courier trips coinciding with withdrawals, digital logs mapping offshore account activity, and surveillance confirming minor errands aligning with the instructions in my wife's letters. Each report reinforced the narrative I had laid out, layer upon layer, until the courtroom itself seemed to lean in, absorbing the web of deceit. Then came the twist. I presented an intercepted letter, one my son had attempted to hide, addressed to an associate overseas. The handwriting was unmistakable, the instructions clear, revealing an additional level of manipulation beyond what I had anticipated. My daughter's hand brushed mine briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the final piece had fallen into place. The $25 million accounts were frozen on the spot, restitution ordered, and the courtroom held its collective breath as the weight of justice settled over the proceedings. My son faltered, charm failing, confidence eroding with every cross-reference I presented. He attempted to argue minor points, yet the documentation was unassailable. Every crumpled bill, every ledger entry, every note, every digital trace formed an airtight case. The judge's gavel punctuated each confirmation, reinforcing the closure of the net we had meticulously built over months. Daughter and I shared a fleeting glance. Her eyes reflected quiet satisfaction, tempered by the gravity of familial betrayal. I noted the gallery, observing reactions, the fleeting flicker of empathy from some, the sharp awareness in others. My son's fleeting remorse was palpable, a ghost of conscience barely surfacing in the face of irrefutable evidence. The courtroom's ambient sounds, gavel taps, papers shuffling, whispered comments, served as a rhythmic underscore to the revelation. I realized in that moment the enormity of what had been accomplished. Justice had been claimed, not in vengeance, but in the meticulous, lawful exposure of betrayal. The letters, affidavits, and crumpled bills, once mundane objects, had become instruments of clarity, symbols of a moral equilibrium restored. Outside, Seattle's rain had softened, casting a muted glow across the courthouse steps. The weight of months of observation, documentation, and patience had culminated in this singular moment. My daughter remained silent beside me, eyes scanning the room as if ensuring that every detail was absorbed, that every lesson was internalized. My son, stripped of pretense, stood diminished by the truth, a stark contrast to the confident figure who had once walked into my workshop months ago. By the time we exited the courtroom, the city seemed quieter, the autumn mist settling over streets now cleansed of deceit. The confrontation, methodical and precise, had achieved its purpose. The $25 million once hidden was secure. The legacy preserved. I carried with me a profound realization. Betrayal can be exposed, deception can be undone, and justice can prevail, not through cruelty, but through persistence, observation, and unwavering adherence to truth. November 11th brought an unusual calm to Seattle. The courthouse drama had ended, but the echoes lingered in our home and workshop. I walked among the tools, receipts, and ledgers, the remnants of months-long investigation, now symbols of restoration rather than tension. Each crumpled bill, every handwritten note, and the carefully preserved letters from my late wife reminded me of what had been at stake and what had been preserved. The $25 million, once hidden behind layers of deceit, was now secure, offshore accounts frozen, restitution ordered, and the son's manipulations exposed for all legal purposes. My daughter and I methodically reviewed the documents again, ensuring no detail had been overlooked. The bills, the invoices, the affidavits, they weren't just evidence anymore. They were markers of clarity, of boundaries restored. Our home and workshop felt lighter. Subtle tension remained, of course. The son was still present, though diminished in confidence, and the quiet acknowledgment of his betrayal hung in the air. Yet, for the first time in months, I could breathe. The legacy my wife had meticulously built and protected was finally shielded from deceit. I traced my finger across the ledger lines one last time, noting dates and amounts with a sense of completion. The workshop, once a theater of observation and suspense, now stood as a symbol of resilience. My daughter's presence was steady and reassuring. She had been instrumental in documenting and confirming every anomaly. Together we had transformed grief and betrayal into a structured path toward justice. Even as Seattle's fog rolled across the streets outside, the soft hum of traffic and distant drizzle became almost soothing. I organized the evidence one final time. Letters back in their envelopes, receipts in chronological order, ledgers carefully closed, keys were returned to their safes, digital backups securely archived. Each act of organization felt like reclaiming a piece of the life we had nearly lost. The son's awareness of the secured legacy was subtle but palpable. He knew every transaction, every document, and every ounce of deception had been exposed. He avoided unnecessary interaction, a quiet acknowledgement of the boundaries now firmly established. I did not seek confrontation. Justice had been claimed without cruelty, with law and observation as instruments. By November 15th, a sense of balance had returned. The workshop, with its familiar sense of metal, oil, and leather, was a sanctuary once more. The crumpled bills and letters served as daily reminders that diligence and attention to detail could preserve what was most precious. Emotional closure began to take root, tempered by lessons learned and the subtle scars left by betrayal. Seattle's twilight filtered through the workshop windows, amber and soft, illuminating the lines on my face that months of tension had etched. I realized that restoring the legacy wasn't simply about money or documents. It was about preserving trust, asserting boundaries, and honoring the foresight of my wife. Each organized ledger, each secured key, and every verified receipt was a step toward reclaiming not just the estate, but the integrity of the family she had cherished. November 16th arrived like a quiet promise. Seattle's streets glistened with recent rain, the city wrapped in a muted gray that mirrored the tentative calm inside our home. My daughter and I moved through the workshop with a sense of purpose, reviewing ledgers, receipts, and letters one final time. The air, once thick with tension, now carried a subtle sense of completion. Trust, I realized, was the fragile piece of legacy most difficult to reclaim. Money had been secured, deception exposed, and the son's manipulations halted, but rebuilding the intangible, the confidence and faith between parent and child, required patience, observation, and deliberate steps. I watched my daughter's interactions, noting how she observed her brother now, cautiously but without hostility. The lessons of betrayal lingered, but understanding and structure had begun to reframe our family dynamic. We walked through the workshop, touching each tool, each ledger, each meticulously organized receipt. Each object told a story, some of betrayal, some of foresight, but all now tied to resolution. The documents were no longer instruments of confrontation, but markers of regained order. I spoke softly to my daughter, outlining the next steps: document archiving, securing digital copies, and reviewing financial reconciliations to ensure nothing was overlooked. Even my son seemed to grasp the transformation. He avoided unnecessary interactions, yet there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. His brief glances at the whiteboard, now cleared of investigative notations, carried a silent message. He understood the boundaries that had been firmly established. It was not reconciliation, but it was recognition. The workshop, with its familiar sense of oil, leather, and metal, became a space of reflection, I traced my hands over ledgers once again, confirming that every entry matched our documented evidence. Each verification was a step toward reclaiming trust, a demonstration that careful observation and lawful diligence could restore stability even after profound deception. We spent the next few days reviewing each transaction and letter, speaking softly about lessons learned without recrimination. The act of reviewing together, of quietly acknowledging the past while preparing for the future, began to build a new framework of accountability and transparency. The rhythm of the workshop, the soft hum of machinery, the occasional drip of rain outside, the rustle of paper served as a meditation, reinforcing a calm focus that had eluded us during the height of betrayal. By November 20th, a sense of catharsis had settled. The accounts were secure, the documents archived, and the financial and emotional frameworks restored. My daughter and I embraced briefly, a quiet acknowledgement of survival, diligence, and justice. The sun, now a subdued presence, lingered on the periphery, a reminder of past betrayal, but also of the restored structure we had built. In the evenings, I walked the workshop alone, reviewing each ledger, receipt, and letter in silence. The exercise was not merely for verification. It was a reaffirmation that trust, once fractured, could be approached with patience, observation, and meticulous care. Justice had been served, and with it the path to reclaiming trust, slow, deliberate, and anchored in transparency, had begun. Seattle's nightfall brought with it a muted calm, the distant traffic and falling rain forming a gentle cadence. In that quiet, I understood that the legacy my wife had left was not just financial. It was moral, procedural, and protective. By following her foresight and combining it with patient, deliberate action, we had restored not only the estate but the principles she had valued. November 21st began quietly, with Seattle's drizzle soft against the workshop windows. I sat alone at my desk, letters from my late wife spread before me. Each envelope, each crumpled bill, each carefully preserved note was more than paper. They were milestones, evidence of foresight, and guides through a decade of deception. I traced the faded ink with my fingers, remembering the sharp, deliberate hand that had written each line, the subtle guidance hidden beneath ordinary words. I reflected on the path that had brought us here, the betrayals, the whispered phone calls, the crumpled bills, the offshore accounts, the micro-expressions of a son caught in his own web of deceit. It had been a meticulous process, built on observation, patience, and law-abiding diligence. And yet, amid all that strategy and calculation, the emotional resonance remained. Grief, anger, and sorrow had been transformed into understanding, foresight, and ultimately, justice. I reread one particular letter, the handwriting still precise, the words cutting with clarity, instructions for documenting transactions, protecting assets, and observing behavior. It was as though she had anticipated the very manipulations that would unfold, providing a map through shadows I could now follow with confidence. The $25 million, once hidden, was secure, the estate intact. But more importantly, boundaries had been restored, and justice had been claimed not through cruelty, but through meticulous lawful exposure of deceit. My daughter entered quietly, carrying her notebook of observations, digital files, and printed affidavits. Together we revisited key evidence, the crumpled $2,800 electricity bill, the $4,200 apartment invoice, the $699,842 bank slip, the sticky notes, and the PI reports. Each document was a reminder of lessons learned, patience, attention to detail, and the power of observation. We sat in silence, the soft hum of the workshop and the gentle patter of rain outside forming the soundtrack. There was no celebratory fanfare. This was reflection, introspection. The act of reviewing each letter, each record, was not just about confirming justice. It was about honoring her foresight and the integrity she had embedded in every detail. I realized that revenge had never been the goal. The goal had been boundaries, clarity, and justice. Every crumpled bill, every annotation, every meticulous record had become a symbol of that understanding. The betrayal had been exposed, the deception unmasked, and the legacy restored. But the emotional lessons were just as vital. Vigilance, observation, and the understanding that trust must be both earned and protected. I closed the final envelope carefully, returning the letters to their archival place. The workshop, once a theater of observation, manipulation, and subtle suspense, now felt like a sanctuary of lessons learned. I leaned back, taking a moment to breathe, the weight of months of preparation and reflection settling into a sense of quiet resolution. And in that silence, I whispered a truth that would outlast betrayal, deception, and time. You didn't set lose me, you gave me away. December had settled over Seattle with its usual damp gray, but inside the workshop, a quiet warmth prevailed. The court had spoken, the estate was secure, and the $25 million my wife had hidden was finally shielded from deceit. My daughter and I moved through the space with a calm precision, reviewing ledgers and documents one last time, ensuring nothing remained unresolved. The tension that had gripped our home for months was replaced with deliberate clarity and methodical order. The son, now publicly aware of the consequences of his actions, maintained a subdued presence. He made no unnecessary attempts at charm or deflection. Occasionally, I caught him glancing toward the archives where the letters, receipts, and affidavits were kept. His acknowledgment was silent but unmistakable, a recognition of boundaries firmly established. Life began to resume a rhythm within the workshop. Tools were returned to their places, ledgers stored, and digital files secured. Every crumpled bill and annotated note became a reminder of diligence and vigilance. The daughter and I spent afternoons walking through the documents, retracing the steps of our investigation, confirming the security of every account, every asset, every piece of evidence. The restoration of the legacy was not just financial, it was moral, it was procedural, it was the reestablishment of principles my wife had instilled through foresight, observation, and meticulous documentation. We began to talk quietly about what had been learned, sharing reflections that went beyond numbers and ledgers, about patience, trust, and the consequences of deceit. Even in the son's subdued demeanor, there were subtle signs of recognition. He began making gestures of reconciliation, brief and careful, acknowledging his role without words. There was no forgiveness yet, but there was understanding. And that, I realized, was part of the restitution we had achieved, accountability and awareness layered atop the financial and legal closure. The workshop thrived in the aftermath, a quiet sanctuary of lessons learned. The rain outside fell softly, tapping against the windows, a gentle reminder of time passing and the restoration of order. Each crumpled bill, letter, and ledger remained as markers, not of betrayal, but of clarity, justice, and diligence. By December 10th, a sense of balance had fully returned. The son's public acknowledgement of his actions, however small, marked the final acknowledgement of the consequences he could no longer evade. The legacy, once under threat, was intact. Family bonds, though altered and scarred, had regained a fragile stability, tempered by lessons hard learned. The letters that had once been instruments of revelation now symbolized clarity, justice, and the enduring power of observation and patience. Seattle's fog lingered outside, but inside the workshop was bright with understanding. I moved through the space slowly, revisiting ledgers, receipts, and letters, each touch a quiet reflection on the path we had traversed. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving lessons etched into memory and practice, ready to guide us through whatever challenges lay ahead. December 11th dawned gray and still, the kind of morning in Seattle that makes even the familiar streets feel foreign. The letter, the one that had arrived 10 years late, sat quietly in its archival envelope on the workshop desk. It had fulfilled its purpose, revealing the betrayal, guiding the evidence, and securing the fortune. But the irony was not lost on me. The message had arrived long after her passing, yet justice had been delivered precisely on time. I moved through the workshop, touching the ledgers and receipts that had once been instruments of discovery. Each crumpled bill, each annotated letter, and every affidavit now symbolized a lesson in foresight and patience. The son, aware of the exposure and the consequences, lingered on the periphery, his presence subdued, acknowledging boundaries without a word. He had tried to manipulate, to conceal, but the meticulous documentation, observation, and patience of my daughter and me had rendered every effort futile. I paused at the safe, tracing my fingers across the cool metal. The $25 million, once hidden behind layers of deceit, was secure. The offshore accounts were frozen, and restitution confirmed. The workshop was quiet, except for the soft patter of rain against the windows, each drop marking the passage of time and the closure of a decade-long chapter. The poetic irony was clear. A letter delayed for 10 years had orchestrated the exposure of betrayal, the legal restoration of the estate, and the reaffirmation of principles my wife had always valued. The son's last attempt at secrecy had been foiled by evidence he had tried to hide, yet the timing of the revelation had been perfectly aligned with justice. It was a truth that seemed almost scripted, yet it had unfolded entirely through law, observation, and moral rigor. I closed the safe slowly, a quiet ritual that marked the end of the storm. The letters, the crumpled bills, and the ledgers remained silent witnesses to diligence and patience. I whispered to the empty workshop, a quiet acknowledgement of lessons learned and boundaries restored. You didn't lose me, you gave me away. In that moment, the workshop felt complete. The legacy, both financial and moral, had been preserved. Family bonds, though tested and scarred, had been tempered with clarity. And the delayed letter, once a symbol of loss, now represented justice achieved on time, precision orchestrated through foresight, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. Seattle's streets were damp and quiet outside, but inside the workshop hummed with resolution. Every document, every crumpled bill, and every handwritten letter stood as a testament to the power of observation, integrity, and patience. The poetic irony was that the very instrument of revelation, the letter, had been delayed, yet it had delivered the outcome at the perfect moment. Justice, it seemed, had its own timing. I stood for a moment, letting the weight of the decades settle into a sense of completion. The storm of betrayal had passed. The evidence was archived, the legacy secured, and the moral boundaries reinforced. In the end, the lesson was clear. Deception can be revealed, betrayal exposed, and justice realized, not through force, but through meticulous care, observation, and timing. And above all, the truth always finds its way.